Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shankari Goldstein, host of the Inspiring Minds series for the Mind and Life Institute. I'm so glad that you could join us for the launch of our second season. We have some truly impressive speakers and musical guests to share with you today and in the months ahead. But first, I would like to acknowledge that for nearly 10,000 years, the Monacan people whose unceded land I'm joining you from here in Charlottesville, Virginia, cared for and stewarded the land of this Piedmont region. In an effort to preserve their incredible legacy, I continue to strive every day to become a better caretaker of this land and the farm that I occupy. So just taking a moment to acknowledge them. And please share where you're tuning in from and whose territory that you reside on in the chat so that we can connect together as community and acknowledge the ancestors who are watching over us. So for those of you who are new to Mind and Life, our work aims to elevate insights at the intersection of science, contemplative wisdom, and action. We believe such knowledge is critical in cultivating personal well-being, building more compassionate communities, and strengthening the relationship between humans and Earth. We launched Inspiring Minds last October in response to the unprecedented challenges that we were facing in our world. In season 1, we explored profound issues from the role of mindfulness in racial healing to how we can cultivate greater attention in today's era of misinformation. These conversations go deep, yet each offers practical actions that we can all take to show up fully and be a force for good. I encourage you to check out our previous episodes on our website. Today, we're going to explore how contemplative traditions can build resilience and strengthen social change movements. Specifically, we'll look at how Christian contemplative practice is being used to reinforce our sense of kinship with each other and the natural world. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank Mind and Life's generous supporters and so much of our donors that have come through for us in this last year, as well as all of you who contributed during the registration process for this program. Your generosity is deeply appreciated. We're going to open our episode today with a contemplative arts offering from Richmond, Virginia, from Lainey Sullivan and Jameson Price. Their extraordinary music fuses together pulses of drone pop and worldly instrumentations that can best be described as a landscape that's a biome all its own. So much of Holy River's music and presence as musicians and activists allow the listener to connect with their natural world and their surroundings. So if you can, find a space to close your eyes and drop into your surroundings, or if you'd like, I encourage you to get up and move your body and tap into the expansiveness of your heart. We hope that you enjoy this illuminating and joyful experience. Please welcome my dear, dear friends, Holy River.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having us, and we're so grateful to be here with you today. And this first song we're going to play is called Awake. Awake. And we're just gonna play one more really short song where Jameson is going to play the mason jar. The song is called Smoke and Rock, and it's about how all of the creatures that exist on the earth know how to exist and continue existing without making such an intense impact. Except for us humans, we haven't figured that out yet. So this is a meditation on our impact and why we have such a hard time figuring that out as a collective society.
Thanks, Lainey. Thanks, Jameson. Even in the middle of a food forest in an old 1800s farmhouse, your haunting and powerful melodies shine through. So just so you two know, we had a little bit of internet issues. You were pretty clear, but at any point I might kind of come on and help you if interject if when we're coming back to chat with you in a little bit. But thank you both. That was so beautiful. We appreciate that. And they're going to both be coming back and joining us in on this chat shortly. So first, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We have Fred Banson joining us, who's joining us from Southwest Montana, where he lives with his family, and he's been exploring ideas around the rise of contemplatives within Christianity. He recently joined us as a presenter at this year's Summer Research Institute on climate change, and he's an award-winning writer. He's the author of Soil and Sacrament. His essays and journalism had appeared in publications including the Oxford American, Orion, The Sun, The Best American Spiritual Writing, and his most recent work has appeared in Harper's. And we also have Father Adam Bucko, who's joining us from New York City, where he has been a leading voice and has spent 15 years working with homeless youth living in the street. He's truly a pioneer in the movement for the renewal of Christian contemplative spirituality. And after growing up in Poland, he spent time as a world traveler, living and serving in monastic communities and ashrams around the globe. He currently serves as the director of the Center for Spiritual Imagination in New York City. So thank you both for joining us for our season 2 opener. And please note that we will try to leave time towards the end of our conversation for 1 to 2 questions from our live audience. If you can refrain from filling in the chat with your questions at this time, we'd greatly appreciate it. So I'm going to begin with you, Adam. There's a story that you share of a young homeless girl, and I believe this took place on the streets of India, and how seeing her and feeling the touch of her hand had such an emotional impact on your life and in your work. Can you describe how that experience has carried over into your work with homeless youth in New York City, and how the role of contemplative practice in individual healing and collective action has also been framed by that experience?
Thank you, Shankari, for this question, and it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. In terms of this question, you know, I went to India as a seeker in my mid-20s after spending some time in different ashrams and monasteries. And I went to India because I've read all the books about, you know, yogis and lamas, and I went there to enter this small hermitage, a Hindu-Christian hermitage outside of Rishikesh, where both of these traditions were blended together. And so I went there for kind of mystical reasons, you could say. And when I arrived in India, I had this experience of meeting this homeless child, an experience that I think many people probably have when they go to India. It happened in the middle of the night. She emerged out of a dark alley and she just came up to me, took my hand and started walking with me, asking me to buy her something to eat. And, you know, I had all these stories in my mind that people told me, well, you know, just ignore whatever you see, go straight to the ashram and etc. But it was this experience when all of a sudden I was face to face with this little child. She was about 13 years old, just skin and bones. Her face was burned with cigarettes. She was wearing this rag or something, a dress that was not very clean. And I don't know what happened, but when she held my hand, all of a sudden I felt like every single button that I had that would kind of take me over the edge was pushed in me. And I felt like my life was kind of falling into pieces, like my very sense of self was kind of being shattered in that moment. And all of a sudden I had this sense that whatever my call in life is, she's part of it. She is a call that I need to respond to. And that was really the beginning of my journey of integrating contemplation and action. Before meeting that little girl, I thought I knew something about contemplative prayer. I thought I knew something about contemplation. But it's only after that, when I moved into this kind of neo-monastic community, a Christian ashram located in the slums outside of Delhi, that something in me was opened. And I began to hear that holy whisper of God, that almost silent whisper of the divine that we often hear in our contemplative prayer. And that began calling me to a different kind of a life, to a life where contemplation could be practiced on the street. And that brought me back to the US and to my work with homeless youth that I have done for about 15 years. And it's really from those kids that I learned what it means to be a contemplative, what it means to experience mindfulness or heartfulness, what it means to become a channel for the peace of the divine, you know. They were my teachers.
That's so beautiful. And, you know, I love so much about the work that you and Fred do. You talk about embodiment a lot in the work that you do, and the embodiment experience within communities that engage in these mindfulness-based interventions. And I think the ability to look at a homeless child to see that pureness within her and feel a deep sense of interconnection with her, that truly can be achieved through the contemplative practices that you're going to be talking about today. And I just want to lift up some of the research and data, because that's such an important part of the work that Mind and Life does, the science and the rigor. And there's some research and data from scholars such as Samantha Brown and Kimberly Bender, whose work examined that mindfulness practice has shown to be an effective approach for improving well-being among adults, with increasing support for its use to enhance regulatory capacities among vulnerable youth. And Bender and Brown, they cite several studies that show that youth experiencing homelessness who participated in mindfulness-based programs, much of like the work that you do, Adam, demonstrated longer-term improvements in spirituality and resilience, mental well-being, as well as a reduction in psychological symptoms. And ultimately, these practices allowed them to better attend to risks in their environment and their interaction with others. And clearly, there's challenges, I think, that are faced in these practices over time. So I know that there were two mindfulness methodologies, Adam, that you spoke about, that you shared, that you work with within your community. Maybe you can share your process with us a little bit, and maybe any methods of improvement that you've seen over the years as mindfulness has become more widely recognized, and how this is ultimately leading you to deeper states of building trust and reconciliation with that community. And I think you're muted, Adam, so we're going to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Sorry about that. So first of all, when we started in the early 2000s, in 2004, I believe, a lot of these practices were not really as popular or available, especially in homeless shelters, or especially among the community of young people who really are living on the streets of our cities. When we began introducing contemplative practices to them, we realized that not very many people were interested in the spiritual jargon that oftentimes accompanies some of these practices. People didn't necessarily want to hear about spirituality. A lot of them, because they identify as LGBTQ, were tremendously hurt by our religious traditions. And that goes, you know, for Christian tradition, for Buddhist or Hindu tradition, and etc. A lot of those kids ended up on the street because their religious parents or their spiritual leaders told them that they should simply not tolerate their kids being LGBTQ. So there was a tremendous hurt. But what we realized early on is that even though young people were not interested in spirituality, every one of them struggled with this one question, which is, what am I going to do with my life? The world around me seems to be falling apart. How am I going to respond to that? How am I going to build my life on top of this collapsing world that I see, you know? And that referred especially to some of the realities of the streets that they've experienced. And so we began working with these two reflective questions with them, essentially gathering them in a community that could reflect on these two questions. And the first one was, what breaks your heart? And the second one was, what makes you truly alive? And we kind of advised them to work with these questions in a way that Rilke talked about when he wrote the letter to the young poet. He said that it's not about providing answers. It's about holding these questions with every cell of your body, with every cell of your being. It's about living those questions. And what we noticed is that when young people would just sit with those questions and really struggle with them and really hold them and go into the depths of what breaks their heart, into the depths of their true aliveness, something would happen in them, and we would see that their operating system, so to speak, there would be a crack, and all of a sudden they would feel this infusion of something bigger, right? This creative impulse that would just begin to arise in them. And they would essentially receive this insight that would be connect to what their life needs to be, what their calling needs to be, how to transform some of their wounds and turn them into gifts that they could offer the world. And a lot of those kids began having those experiences of deep insight about what their lives need to be. And so in our view, it's those two questions that really led them to what I would consider to be a contemplative experience. And in a Christian tradition, a contemplative experience is not just necessarily about experiencing balance, about experiencing peace. Yes, all of those things are supposed to accompany the contemplative experience, but most of all, it's about experiencing this impulse of the divine that begins to arise in our heart, where our job is to welcome it and to allow it to take over our lives, to transform all of our stuff, all of our wounds, all of our gifts into something that could become our gift, that we can offer the world, where our greater gifts can begin to meet some of the cries of the world, right? And so in our experience, that was really what began creating some change in the lives of those kids. And many of them, as a result of some of those practices, begin to go back to some of the shelters that they used to live in, and bring back some of those practices, some of the things that worked for them. And they really became kind of a little army of spiritual special forces that would go to those neighborhoods, that would go to the streets, and bring some of those compassionate ways of being with ourselves, some of those compassionate ways that can really turn our, struggles into something that could be useful to the world.
Yeah, I love that vision of arming, people with these concrete actions of love, these concentrative practices, mantra, prayer, breath work, and objectless awareness, sitting with that present state of surrender. So I really appreciate you lifting some of those interventions up, Adam. Fred, I'd love to bring you into the conversation as we're beginning to see this deep connection emerge between contemplation and maybe talk a little bit more about how the Christian faith comes in, and how when emerged with activism work, it can lead to more adaptive functioning and overall improved well-being. The work of being an activist or even a member of society shows us that there's still so many daunting and complex issues that we must face day in and day out. And it's a significant one being the environment. For many people, the climate crisis can feel insurmountable. And I'd love if you could just share with our audience your experience with activist burnout and how contemplative traditions supported you personally and their use in broader movement building that you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Shankari, and great to be with you and with Adam and Holy River and all of you folks out there in Zoom land. I came at contemplative practice really, you mentioned burnout in your question, and that was a huge part of it. I had, for a number of years, I directed a community garden. It was really sort of more of a community farm in North Carolina, teaching low-income families how to grow and share food. And it was bio-intensive. We used hand tools. It was very labor-intensive. Took a lot of work just managing the farm, but also teaching and organizing volunteers and raising money and all the things that go into running a nonprofit. And for a number of years, I just sort of threw myself at it headlong. And, what could be more compelling than teaching people how to grow food? I mean, it's very tangible, and the rewards of doing that work were, innumerable, and I really thrived on it. And yet I found myself working, 60, 70 hours a week. And I had a young family at the time. My boys were really small. My wife was in graduate school. And at a certain point, I just hit a wall, and just kind of inwardly collapsed. And that led to me sort of rediscovering the contemplative practices within my own Christian tradition of silence and solitude and contemplative prayer using a mantra rather than what I call the just wanna prayer. God, I just want to ask you, I just want to thank you, that's kind of what I grew up learning how to pray, is you sort of rattle off this long list of needs. And it's really a gift to learn that you can just sink into being. You don't have to say anything. you can just sink into silence and sink into that kind of wordless depth of contemplative practice. And so that was a huge discovery for me. And it led me to the journey I've been on ever since, which is thinking about not only how can contemplative practices help us as individuals, avoid burnout or recover from burnout in our work, but how can we start to shift these big societal issues? And especially for me, I think a lot about climate change. That's kind of how I got into climate change, was through sustainable agriculture and realizing that, climate change is having a huge impact on the way we grow food. And yet food is also an incredible way that we can heal the climate by sequestering carbon in the soil. But how does contemplative practice help us both avoid burnout, but also start to shift our mindset more in tune with the non-human world? And so we can, I have a few thoughts on that we can get into, but that's kind of a little background of my journey. And a lot of that involved a sort of rediscovery of the desert tradition within Christianity, the tradition of men and women going off into the desert, leaving the known world behind, and setting off into the unknown of the inner life. So,
yeah, I really love that you've given just like simple tools to help activists make that connection of a deeper contemplative practice. And we find ourselves getting caught in those everyday stresses and to-do lists. And for most people, we forget about the sweetness of that present moment, that stillness. And I think our climate is asking us to really ask different questions and practice new ways of being in community with each other and ourselves. And we're seeing this energetic shift that, wants us to reclaim these ancient Christian and indigenous traditions. So can you share more about how these approaches have personally impacted your views of faith, what you're seeing emerging in the field of Christianity and contemplative science and practice? How does it land with you?
Yeah, so maybe by way of answering that, I want to read a short couple of paragraphs here. So as a writer, I don't know what I think until I put it down into words on the page. And so I use writing as a way to figure out what I'm trying to understand. And this is a short essay that I wrote, or this is a short excerpt from an essay that I wrote about this time last year. It was published in Emergence magazine, and I can include the link if people want to see the essay. It's called Keeping the World in Being. And I got the title from this book, The Lives of the Desert Fathers, about the early desert monks in 3rd and 4th and 5th century Egypt. And there's a line in that book, it was said about them that through their prayers, through their practice, they were the ones who kept the world in being. And I've always been really taken with that idea that, and this is not just within Christianity, it's within Judaism as well, the idea of the 40 righteous people that are the ones who keep the world going. And I'm sure it's in other traditions as well, but within the Christian monastic tradition, that sense of the ones who are doing that inner work are the ones who keep the world from spinning off its axis. And I think that's just a captivating idea to me. And so I ended up writing about this early chronicler of the desert monastic movement in the 5th century, and his name was John Cassian. And here's a couple paragraphs on what he was about. "The mind is always on the move," wrote John Cassian, a 5th century monk who chronicled the rise of Christian monasticism. Flitting for years across the Levant and North Africa, Cassian was a body on the move, traveling as both reporter and phenomenologist of the inner life. He sought out those familial clusters of monks who had burrowed into the desert sands of North Africa to live out their days in contemplative prayer, their lives open to the sky. Cassian's single-minded pursuit was to understand the practice of contemplatio, the gaze turned in the direction of the things of God, as he described it. He wanted to know how one initiated such a gaze, what experiences it produced, how one stayed there without distraction. The trick was to outfox the mind, which he described as a dilettante and speedy taster of spiritual ideas, rather than their creator and possessor, pulled like a drunk in every direction. Think about that. I love that image. The mind pulled like a drunk in every direction. Anchoring the mind through contemplation was for those early Christian monks the practice, but the goal, the one thing needful around which the entire scaffolding of monastic life was built, was focused on a different organ of perception. When Cassian and his friend Germanus began their contemplative sojourn through Egypt, they stopped first of all at the cell of Abba Moses, a former highway robber turned monk, to whom many of the early desert sayings are attributed. Every art and discipline is preceded by some objective, Abba Moses told them. Our objective is puritas cordis, purity of heart, or as he later described it, a heart kept free of all disturbance. And so as I think about that, I'm really drawn to that idea of, first of all, here's this desert monk writing in the 5th century, and yet he's just speaking right into our situation right now. I mean, that sense of our minds being pulled in every direction like a drunk, right? Monkey mind, and the need to focus and the need to hone in on that which is most important in the moment. And so that's it's just a little taste, I think, of how the desert tradition can help us. It's helped me avoid that scattered sense, especially when I think about climate change and these big overwhelming issues. It's so easy to just have your energy diffused into this kind of vague anxiety. And I think contemplative practice really can bring us back right into our bodies, right into the present moment, and anchor our awareness there.
That's so beautiful. Did you want to add anything, Adam? I love that you referenced the monkey mind. Adam has had the pleasure of getting to meet Sri Swami Satchidananda, I believe, and I studied under him, and he talks about the drunken monkey mind. Did you want to add anything to that about, what you're seeing emerging from the Christian contemplative practices?
Yes, and thank you, Fred, for that beautiful reflection and that beautiful piece that you read. And thank you, Shankari, for mentioning Swamiji. When I spent a few months at his ashram, Satchidananda Ashram or Yogaville, he was still around, and he was such a wonderful presence to hang out with. And he talked about the monkey mind a lot. I think something that is very important to mention in this conversation, especially since this is not necessarily a Christian gathering, is that a lot of these practices that Fred talked about, a lot of this kind of new energy that we have in the Christian contemplative space about meditative practices that our tradition has. I think it's important to acknowledge that some of that came from the interaction that some of the Western monks had with Hindu swamis, with Buddhist monks, with Sufi practitioners. And I think that is a very important thing, because within some Christian churches, we are known for being very close-minded when it comes to other traditions. And the truth is that I believe that, at least in the West, many of these practices would have not been known if it had not been for Christian monks who began interacting with some of the practitioners of other traditions, who really enabled them to who gave them new eyes to reevaluate our tradition and to find some of these forgotten practices in our tradition. So that's maybe the only thing that I would like to add.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you each shared positive ways that, you know, these Christian contemplative practices are, and just contemplative practices in general, are being used to support vulnerable populations and meet urgent societal needs, which is so much about what we wanted to hone in on in today's conversation. And I think it's really important too to talk about, at the same time, there's this valid criticism that contemplative practice can lead to spiritual bypassing, meaning those who engage in regular practice can feel absolved from further action. So Adam, maybe you can share how to guard against this and how mindfulness can translate into active citizen engagement.
Yes, you know, the thing that I always repeat, especially when I talk to non-monastics, is this little spiel that I always say, which is, given today's crisis the world over, we can no longer afford to hide all of our contemplatives in their comfortable monasteries.
That's right.
We need to reunite contemplation and action, because we need spiritual activists and actually really spiritual warriors on the streets of our cities and in all of our professions and institutions. We need them there so they can reinvent those institutions, those communities with spiritual values, which will enable us to see every person in need, every structural imbalance in our world, every cry, including the cry of the earth, as a call to be answered. And I know in my life, when I was initiated into contemplative practice, at first in Hindu monasteries and then later on in Christian monasteries, I began to believe that a contemplative life is the most advanced way to have a spiritual life. And a lot of that is really present in all of our traditions, where the goal of spiritual life is some kind of a hermit or a monk sitting on top of the mountain, you know, contemplating the big questions of life, getting absorbed in the divine, or whatever we want to call that. And what I realized was that in my experience, that kind of logic, that kind of theology really got me to a point where I started to disconnect from my body, from my emotions, from a way of being able to be in relation to the world. And all of my energy was dedicated to building this kind of an ideal of presence and peace. And you know, the promise that all of those traditions offered was, if you practice this kind of way of living, if you meditate for a few hours a day, you will experience this peace. And to be quite honest with you, I was experiencing this peace, but it was almost like I was in some kind of a spiritual coma, because I was not really alive. And I remember one day meeting this Carmelite hermit who said that, you know, the first step on a mystical journey is to fall in love with life. And I remember looking at myself and thinking about my life and realizing that not only was I not in love with life, I was barely alive, right? Because I kept on disconnecting from everything that was me so much that I ended up in this kind of a spiritual coma. And it's only when I was brought back to the world by those homeless kids that I started realizing that contemplative practice, meditation is not really enough, that we also need to engage in psychotherapy, that we also need to engage in all of those practices that can enable us to explore our shadow, because otherwise we will spiritualize our wounds, we will avoid dealing with things that are preventing us from full aliveness. And so one of the best things that I've experienced in my life was also in my late 20s, when I went to psychotherapy with a person who was a Zen monk and a Jungian, and who really guided me on this journey to reconnect with everything that I was pushing under.
Mm.
And one of the first experiences that I had was this sense of integration. Before that process, I was kind of operating out of this idealized spiritual persona, where everything that didn't belong there had to be pushed under and kept tightly in control. What he enabled me to do was to invite everything in. And all of a sudden, there was this sense of many different competing voices kind of fighting for who's going to get the mic. And then the spiritual process became not about excluding any of those voices, but rather bringing them into a conversation with each other. So the crowd of voices could be transformed into a community. And that's when I realized that even those things that, I was afraid of that could hinder my spiritual development, when brought in and included and given tools to be in conversation with everything else that was alive in me, that those things would not only not hinder me, but they would become sources of inspiration, energy, and they would enable wholeness. So for example, in our spiritual community, the community of the Incarnation, every single person who is introduced into contemplative practice, every single person who commits to a vowed new monastic path is also required to be in psychotherapy, in addition to spiritual direction and etc. So this way we can avoid, spiritual bypass. So we can not only have an experience of waking up, but also an experience of growing up as human beings, maturing as kind of whole persons.
Father Adam just took us to church. I want to bring up two who I consider spiritual warriors that you just talked about, real activists, Lainey and Jameson, to add to this conversation around radical honesty. I love that you both are looking for ways to have deep conversations around the deconstruction of systems and how we show up in them and evolve beyond them, whether it's using art, food, music, relationship building. You both have grown up in the church, I think Protestant and Pentecostal, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And Jameson, you lead a workshop titled The Post-Traumatic Christian. And so much of what Adam just shared reminded me that we can perhaps zoom out a little bit and look at spiritual bypassing through a transformative justice lens and start addressing not just personal harm, but systemic harm and repeated and learned behavior, and really connect more deeply to these positive aspects of these faith-based traditions. And so just looking at the diversity of truths, Lainey, if you can share, how do you begin, or how can you see us beginning to heal personal damage caused by potentially restrictive religious culture by using, or even capitalism, which you guys rally against so much by using these contemplative practices and foundations?
Well, first off, I love what you said, Adam. That was so on point, because I think about that all the time. Being someone who goes and visits ashrams, which are these special places where people go to meditate and to focus on themselves, and being a very service-oriented person who's out in the community a lot, and seeing the imbalance at times, and understanding, if we think about Christ as our teacher, he had a balance where he would go into the wilderness and then he would come out and serve, and he would serve to his capacity until he couldn't anymore. And then he'd go back into that contemplative state. So obviously it's a tool that we've been taught in our tradition to use, but we don't stay there all the time. And yes, it is like a crisis time where we have to act, it's like that's where we were born into right now at this junction. It's so funny, Shankari, because you asked this diversity of truth question, and I feel like it's multifaceted, and like there's the aspect of like diversity of truth in spirituality and diversity of truth in the physical realm, and I think that those are two different things. And I think part of my deconstruction, reconstruction happened around studying comparative world religion in college. And in my first class, they brought up, I think in one of the very first classes we did, they said, what is a cult? And their definition of a cult was any group of people who believe they are the only source of truth and that there's no truth outside of their worldview.
And so there's some overlap in the Venn diagram of religious communities and cults, but there's also you can be religious, you can be spiritual, and hold space for that spirit is very large and manifests in many, many different ways, obviously. That's right. But then there's also the diversity of truth in the world of physical things, where when we're facing things like the climate crisis, or like the coronavirus, and there's still people who are saying, I don't know if this coronavirus is real. I don't know if the climate crisis is real. And that's a different situation where I feel that we are tripping ourselves up as humans, as the human collective society, where we are not going to be able to address these extreme issues in the time that's needed for us to shift and continue to survive if we're still in an existential crisis of whether or not the climate crisis is real or not, or whether or not coronavirus is real or not, or whether or not racism is real enough. Like, these things, yes, they exist and they have existed, and we have to change our systems. We have to work together. But if we don't come to an agreement about that, then yeah, I have a hard time holding space for a diversity of truths in that respect.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Jameson, I'd love for you to just kind of share with us, you lead a workshop, called The Post-Traumatic Christian. So how are you personally reframing a relationship with a conscious Christ in the modern church, given everything that we've just heard, these beautiful things we've just heard and sharings from Fred and Adam?
Well, thanks, Shankari, for the question. And thanks, Adam and Fred, for both speaking. I've been resonating a lot with what y'all are saying, and have a lot of appreciation for what you're both doing. I think something that I bring up a lot in the workshops, and this is true even when we're talking about a lot of other systemic cultural issues as well, is just educating ourselves on history and understanding what the history of things are, right? And so going back and reading from a historical point of view of what happened at the church, when was it politically occupied, talking about even from the times of when it was taken over by Constantine and the Romans, and then how did it always go through this ebb and flow of groups of people that were resisting what the state's occupation of that faith was doing, and what the state occupation of that faith was doing, and understanding in the same way that, like, I wouldn't blame the horse that fought in the Confederate War, applying that to the same way as, like, not throwing the water out, or not throwing baby Jesus out with the bathwater kind of thing. And so sort of understanding that there is this, there's been a legacy of a lot of different participation, and there has been a state occupation of things. And so a lot of times when I think people are angry or have difficulty with the modern political church, I want to get to naming what the thing is that is the problem. Because oftentimes if we can dismantle and start to look at our Christian practices, or me being raised in that faith, there's a lot of beauty in things I can find. And then maybe the things you're actually mad at is like, is sexism, maybe it's patriarchy, maybe it's racism. All these things have been used under this vehicle of Christianity to try to justify, but they're not necessarily intrinsically connected to it. So just sort of separating and getting to those places and understanding true history, dismantling that, and looking at how there's always been mystical traditions from the beginning, and there's always been traditions that have been trying to resist what the state occupation has been. Jesus was killed by the state. Jesus was murdered by the state. So it's really interesting to me that we're seeing this patriotism and Christianity get merged together, when literally the person that represents that faith tradition was murdered by the state because they were politically dangerous.
Fred, I want to give you an opportunity to share here if you'd like. Otherwise, we can start to talk about some of the root work that you do around climate change and soil and sacrament. But I want to just offer a space for you too.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm just enjoying listening to what everybody's saying thus far. So if you have a new direction you want to take us in.
Yeah, that's great. So, moving beyond transforming the root cause of our faith, which you all just did a beautiful job sharing all your viewpoints, and practices into deepening the roots of our connection with the environment. When it comes to reaffirming our connection to the earth, Fred, you talk so beautifully about the importance of nurturing non-dual awareness. And I'd just love to hear you elaborate more on that, if you can.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think a lot of our environmental problems, so-called, I mean, you could say a lot of our societal problems, period, but especially in our relationship to the more than human world, we have these inherited dualisms from the Enlightenment, at least that far back. And this kind of Cartesian dualism of mind and body as being very separate, right? Or the individual, myself, and I'm totally separate from people around me or the world around me, that idea of separation. And it's I think really dangerous and really it's had disastrous effects on our world, because we can just think of the world as a giant Walmart where we can just go take stuff. We can drill into it and extract stuff from it, and it's not going to hurt us, right? And a non-dual awareness would see the world as intricately connected to ourselves, and it would see the more than human world and its health as connected to our own health. And in fact, our own health is at every breath dependent on the more than human world. And so here I sit in Southwest Montana, and as I'm looking out my window, I can see just a gray haze of smoke, and all that smoke is coming from the fires in California, 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And it's been blowing up here since July. And so we've been living and breathing the remains of former forests in California for the past 2 months. And so it's just, if you think about the Cartesian dualism of the independent self, it's just absurd, right? Because no, here I am, and my body, my very being, my physical being, my emotional being is affected at every breath from this world around me, for good and for ill. And I think, for me, a kind of way past that dualistic worldview, and just, I guess, one more example of the dualistic worldview is the whole anti-vaccine mentality that we see right now, with people thinking it's all about personal choice as to whether or not they get a coronavirus vaccine, when it completely ignores the whole idea of communal health and the health of the herd and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So a non-dual way of thinking about things is you're only as healthy as your community around you, right? The human community and the more than human community. And so I think we can cultivate more of a non-dual awareness through contemplative practice, which helps us center ourselves in the moment, and through those kinds of practices that encourage us to think about and practice compassion for others. Mm. So compassion practices for self and others, but also just some basic scientific knowledge too, right? And how important that is, because so much of what we now know from science is that, our bodies, for example, are mostly bacteria, right? And if all of the cells that are Fred Bonson were to disappear, I would still look more or less like myself, just from the bacteria on my skin. And so that, just one example among many of how intricately connected we are to the world around us. I think that basic scientific knowledge is really crucial. So yeah, those two things, scientific literacy and ecological literacy, I would say. Ecology being the study of relationships. And so basic ecological literacy coupled with compassion practices and those kinds of contemplative practices can, I think, really help develop the non-dual awareness that we need to really address climate change.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing your personal story about what you're experiencing in terms of a major climate crisis in Montana. I think right now we're seeing the forest fires, we're seeing the hurricanes, more recently, flash floods around the globe, including Asia, Europe, the floods that you just experienced in New York City, Adam, last week here in the United States. Scientists are looking for ways to plan for the future through research initiatives, much of what you just shared, that having that scientific knowledge, Fred. Columbia University being one of them, doing a global flood initiative, which developed enhanced prediction models for extreme floods, exploring how they impact regions, as well as supply chain networks. And I think on top of the extreme flooding that we're seeing, there's this robust evidence that climate change is affecting the frequency, the intensity, the duration of these heat waves. And you're seeing that out west. So I think right now it feels like an incredibly important time to address, our relationship with water. Lainey and Jameson, if you can share, what have you all learned through your journey of really being advocates, standing up, fighting against pipelines here on the East Coast, becoming warrior water protectors, and what feels really important for other movement leaders and our participants to know right now about that work?
Well, you can win. There's been a lot of winning actually in the struggles that we've been involved in, and it just takes a lot of people, and it takes a diversity of tactics. And do you want to talk about diversity of tactics?
Yeah, I think that's been the thing that I feel like has been revealed to me as some of the most important work, is that oftentimes when you're participating in activism and you find the places that you're good at or that bring you joy, you can start to get in an echo chamber and think that maybe you're the only ones doing anything, or your way is only the right way, kind of going back again to spirituality, the difference between a cult and just a spiritual practice. But having an understanding for a diversity of tactics and knowing that it takes a diversity of tactics to win, meaning it's going to take radical lawyers, people putting their bodies on the line, people that are showing up, people that are making art, people that are in the streets, people that are doing just a variety of different things in order to accomplish the things. And although we have had a lot of victories, everything is sort of, we understand as activists, and I'm sure the rest of y'all have this relationship as well, that it's not just like one thing and then, okay, yay, we did it. It's a lifestyle choice, and knowing that there's always going to be something that's next, and that shouldn't feel overwhelming or sad. There's something really beautiful about rising to the occasion of knowing that you're having a relationship with yourself and with others, and in a reciprocal way with the earth and with community, to be able to see and enact a better version of life. And there's been a legacy of people doing that before us, pushing the rock up the hill. And so there's a beauty in having a livelihood dedicated towards that. And we don't have to get so fixated on the direct outcome. People ask all the time, well, what happens if they build the Mountain Valley Pipeline? What then? It's just like, I would still rather spend my time and energy trying to resist this project out of my relationship and love of the earth and of this community and knowing its impact, than get attached to every single thing having to be the outcome that I want it to be. Because it's beyond just me having a singular idea of outcome. It's me dismantling these mentalities of supremacy. Fred was talking about dualism, and I think a lot of that is just we have these mentalities of supremacy over other humans, over people's race, over their sex, and then supremacy over the land. And so just dismantling these mentalities of supremacy that we carry, and understanding that we are all collective, back to the herd collective community health.
And as humans trying to intercept when these bad ideas are in the world of ideas still, when they're just thoughts on pieces of paper, because that is our human work that we can do with our brains that like no other being here can do. And so I feel like all the education work that anyone does to help people understand what's happening and help stop things before they happen is amazing, because direct action is just like damage control. It's the permit for the company to dump the poison water into the river versus the pipeline in the Gulf, the old oil pipeline that's already burst, and they don't even know who owns the pipeline. And it's, so that's damage control. And we have more power.
So Lainey, you're breaking up. You're breaking up a little bit. We're gonna. Yeah, I'm gonna move on, Lainey, because you're breaking up a little bit. it was hard to hear your last part. Maybe give a second for your internet to catch up, or yeah. So we have time for 2 more questions, maybe from our public audience. I'm going to give our audience time to think about what you might want to ask our 4 speakers. You have the option to raise your hand. That's how we're going to bring you up to ask your question live to our 4 speakers. And in the Zoom features, you'll see you can raise your hand, bring up live to verbally ask the question. So just take some time if you want to go ahead and do that now. And before we move to that, I just want to share this excerpt from a recent article. I believe it's the same article that you just spoke from a minute ago, Fred, that was so beautiful. And I loved it so much. And I pulled something that you wrote. It feels as if we are living amid a great unraveling, a time when our lives are being stripped and harrowed over and over. Humanity has been kicked out of the nest of the Holocene and where we've evolved over the past 10,000 years. And though some say we've begun the Anthropocene, I tend to favor E.O. Wilson's locution, the Ermocene, the age of loneliness. In the midst of so much coming apart, I wonder, where is home? And I loved that line so much. It's like making me get a little emotional. And it leads me to ask for each of you, like, what feels like home for you? And maybe we can start with you, Fred, since they're your beautiful words. What feels like home to you?
Well, thank you for reading that and for your kind words. Yeah, I've lived in a lot of different places in my life. I spent part of my boyhood in Nigeria and West Africa. I've lived for the past 20 years in North Carolina, and much of my growing up years, and now this past year and onward in Southwest Montana. And so, yeah, I think home to me feels a bit more portable, perhaps, these days. And I think of home as that internal space of dropping into my practice. I think that's a home. Mm-hmm. But also most immediately where my spouse and our 3 boys are, wherever they are. But homemaking for me is a lot of it is here in Montana, in this wild place that I spent as a child and am now coming back to with my boys, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and that sense of being this very small dot in this much bigger web of life here in the greater Yellowstone. I think that's my ecological home.
Adam, you want to share what feels like home for you?
Yes, thank you. For me, what is coming up for me is this experience of being with loved ones, where we can just drop into the space of that space of shared heart, where we can accompany each other into places of deep pain and deep joy, and where we have this experience of connectedness, where we can literally help each other to carry our burdens. And so to me, that is really what feels like home, whenever we can touch that special place of interconnectedness and love.
Thank you. Lainey Jameson, what feels like home for you, since you live on the road so much? Your home is everywhere, I assume.
Yeah, echo with what Fred and Adam said, that it's about the people that you're with and its internal landscape, for sure.
I think for me, the same reason why I was attracted back to honoring the legacy of Christianity that I was raised in terms of like doing the work there, was that I knew that I could do more potent work in the place that I was from. And I grew up in Virginia, and we travel a lot, and I traveled quite a bit, and in our early 20s lived all over the place. And for a long time, I had resistance to returning to what I was perceiving as home. But then it sort of hit me that was I had an opportunity to do some of the most potent work that I had the ability to do by returning to this place that I knew really well. I was able to go to commissions and say, yeah, this is where I went to school. I remember when they were having Monument Avenue commissions about whether to take the statues down or not, like 5 years ago, before the summer protests here in Richmond. I was able to get up and speak and say, yeah, I went to Stonewall Jackson Middle School and Lee Davis High School, and I think these things need to come down. I understand that I was indoctrinated with this, and this is, my perspective of that. And I felt like it just carries more weight when I'm able to be in the place where I know so well. But I also resonate with what Adam and Lainey said, that home is in many different places.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we have a couple questions that have come through in the chat, and maybe I can pose this question to Fred. Fred and Adam. Julian Marquez said, thanks for sharing the views regarding the spirituality and religious traditions. My question is, how do we balance or combine the dogmatic definitions of a particular faith with spiritual practices that are related to mindfulness?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I'll turn that to Adam. He's wearing the collar. He's got more of a dogmatic answer to that. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, Fred. Well, when I think about this question, I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said that whenever we're teaching spirituality, experience is not enough. What we have is both an experience and a framework that can help us to connect the dots between different experiences that we're having. And in my work with young people, not just people on the streets, but people who oftentimes call themselves spiritual but not religious, essentially people who are kind of trying to have a spirituality outside of the religious traditions, this is one of the biggest challenges. What is the framework that can help us to connect the dots of our experience? What is the framework that can help us to understand our experience and help us to move deeper into the experience of mystery or the present moment, or however we want to call that? And so I think that dogmatic formulations sometimes can be very helpful to an extent that can help us to do that. Having said that, I also have to acknowledge that all of our traditions, have things that are not spiritually healthy and that can even be damaging. And so I think that in this day and age, all of our traditions should be in conversation with each other. And we should be re-envisioning what some of those healthy religious frameworks are. And all of that needs to be re-envisioned in the context of the contemplative experience, in the context of us being in a conversation with other traditions, and also in the context of what our world needs right now. What are some of the cries that we can hear coming from our world, coming from our hearts, and etc. And so I think that this is work in progress. And there is much good work being done in the Christian tradition, as well as in some of the other traditions. For those who are recovering Christians, one of the books maybe that I would recommend is a book by Scottish theologian who is trying to do that exact thing. And unfortunately, I can't think of the name of the book, but it's something about how to essentially push the restarting button on Christianity. And when I think of the name, I can type it in the thing.
Great. It actually is a good segue into a question that came through about sharing resources. Given the multiple crises that we face today, is there a particular prayer, passage, piece of music, you just referenced a book, Adam, that each of you returns to for guidance and grounding?
I always blank out on questions like this because there's so many.
So many.
Yeah. There's a great book on contemplative prayer, contemplative practice called Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird. That's a great kind of introductory book on sort of a Christian mindfulness, you might say. And there's a question here coming in. I would love to get a referral for ecological literacy.
Saw that.
Yeah. So I'll be thinking of some to type into the chat because again, there's so many. Yeah, I need to just think on that one moment. I'll let the
Yeah.
others.
Absolutely. Lainey, Jameson, anything that helps you ground?
Yeah, that comes up for me when it has to do with resources and ecological literacy is Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein. It really breaks down where capitalism came from and our relationship that we have with the earth now and how it's translated.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I think maybe we have run out of time for any more questions, but I want to thank you all so much for your reflections, your teachings today. It has really showed us how to pause, how to reflect, and show up to create these sustaining and liberated relationships. And what is liberation? You know, there's an activist, Sonia Renee Taylor, who shared that her viewpoints on liberation, she defined them as unobstructed access to each person's ability to manifest the highest version of themselves and just having that radical self-love. So I just want to thank all of you for just coming with your whole expanded hearts, you know, showing up on this very sacred, holy Jewish day of Rosh Hashanah, the new year. I think you've really let us reflect on the awe of the possibility of what it means to plant new seeds, new ways of being in relationship with each other, with the planet, developing new, healthier root systems. So I just want to encourage all of you as participants to just continue to be curious about what it can look like to bring forward, you know, some of these beautiful messages and practices that our speakers have shared with us. And we always ask, you know, one signature kind of question at the end of our shows of Inspiring Mind is, and that's just like what's one concrete action step or insight that you personally feel that you've maybe taken away from this conversation or that you want to share with our audience. And I invite our audience to also respond in the chat as well. Maybe we'll start with you, Adam, if that's okay.
Yes, I was, you know, very moved by Jameson talking about home and returning to a place where he was born and where he grew up. And I think that this metaphor of home that Fred so beautifully also developed in his article is really what contemplative practice is about, to always return to that place, either metaphorically or in a physical way, with every breath we take, touching base with who we are and letting that live and love out loud.
It's beautiful. Lainey, Jameson, you want to share something you're taking away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I have a tremendous gratitude for how much we've been talking about contemplation and just silent, just having moments where we're sitting silently and dwelling with the present moment. And I love thinking about this reframing of what we need right now, right? And like giving permission to say, okay, where did the traditions, where can they connect the dots in the framework work, and applying it to what we need right now, I think is something I'm going to be dwelling on for a while now.
And the balance with the dualism, with the truths, with the sitting in silence and being in action. All wonderful themes.
Great. Any closing thoughts, sharings, reflections, Fred?
Yeah, it's just something very practical. I think, you know, when it comes to earth care, we need to fall in love with our places. And to really fall in love, you have to know the names of the people or things you're falling in love with. And so I think getting to know the names of the trees and the critters and the plants that live around you, I think is a great step to developing a love fierce enough to care for your place.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you all again once more, and maybe close with a little bit of reflection of my own on today's conversation. Today we heard about practices for cultivating hope, a deep felt sense of our interconnection. As Holy River shared on their opening song, we're all standing in the same sunlight where we cannot see each other as divided. And we heard from Adam about how youth who experienced homelessness could be transformed by inner practices into a spiritual army of special forces. And from Fred, we learned about the desert tradition within Christianity and how, in the face of today's crisis, contemplative practice can anchor our awareness in the present moment. And we also talked about spiritual bypassing, the importance of doing deep inner work necessary to wake up, grow up as human beings. And we learned about the role of contemplative practice in science and helping us to cultivate non-dual awareness and how intrinsically connected we all are to each other and the world around us. And I'd love to close with the two questions that Adam posed at the beginning of the conversation, which was, consider what breaks your heart and what makes you feel truly alive, and how can we make a difference in today's world? So thank you all once more. We're going to be gathering together again on Wednesday, October 20th for our second installment of season 2. And we'll be joined by Pumla Gobodo-Matakazela and Aaron Stern and a live spoken word performance from Hawa Kasat. The theme will be healing intergenerational trauma, and registration is now open for our October event through the Mind and Life website. Again, deep gratitude to all of our presenters. Thank you all as participants for joining us. Gratitude to our Mind and Life team that works tirelessly behind the scenes. And please continue to stay connected to Mind and Life as we move forward in these challenging times. And before we close, I'd love to invite Father Adam to lead us in a brief guided meditation. And then we'll close our show today with a musical offering from Holy River. Father Adam.
Thank you. And so as we are sitting with all of this, all of the things that have been evoked in us by this conversation and by this time together, I would like to invite you to close your eyes for a couple of moments and just simply connect with what is alive in you right now. What kind of feelings, sensations, insights have been evoked in you? And could you name them? And could you locate them in your body? Where do some of those things live? Where are they located in your body? And then slowly, one by one, bring all of that into your heart. Imagining that all of those thoughts, feelings, sensations, insights are traveling like little rivers into your heart. And that your heart is big enough to hold all of those newly emerging bits and pieces of your life. And if you like, you can put the two palms of your hands on your heart, holding all of those things that you are gathering in your heart, holding them with tenderness and care, holding them just as if you were holding a little baby, with that same kind of love, with that same kind of tenderness, with that same kind of curiosity. And then imagine that just as you are holding all of those bits and pieces of your life with love and tenderness and care, that now you are being held by this presence, this motherly presence that we call God, that we call the divine, this presence of love that is holding you right now with tenderness and care, this presence that is capable of touching all of your wounds, all of your difficulties, and transforming them into something that could become your unique gift to the world. And so let's just enjoy silence for a moment as I read this prayer of Saint Francis. Beloved God, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Beloved Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And now, let us just rest in this divine presence as we begin to open our hearts to this beautiful musical offering from the Holy River.
Before the mud it piled up, wind my body tied up in silk. I'm